In 1910, a prairie town of barely 2,000 souls raised a school with a marble staircase, a 1,000-seat auditorium, and classrooms for pupils who did not yet exist. Across America, communities did the same. 3, 4, 5 stories of Beaux-Arts stone rising over main streets that emptied by dusk. They weren't building for the children they had. They were building for the metropolis they were certain was coming. So what did the town fathers know or believe that the census did not? What they believed was simple and intoxicating. Whoever built the grandest building would become the region's great city. So the towns didn't merely build schools. They entered an arms race, and the schoolhouse was the weapon. The hunger for grandeur had a source. In 1893, Chicago staged the World's Columbian Exposition, and at its heart stood the White City, a gleaming assembly of white classical halls, domes, and colonnades along reflecting pools. Daniel Burnham directed the construction, with Frederick Law Olmsted shaping the grounds, and the fairgrounds sprawled across roughly 690 acres of Chicago's Jackson Park. Some 27 million visitors passed through the gates between May and October of 1893, at a time when the entire country held barely 63 million people. Millions walked through it and went home dazzled. They carried an idea home. Out of that dazzlement grew the City Beautiful movement of the 1890s and early 1900s. Burnham carried the creed forward himself, replanning the Washington Mall in the Macmillan Plan of 1902 and drafting the Plan of Chicago in 1909. "Make no little plans," he told his fellow architects. "They have no magic to stir men's blood." Its creed was almost mystical. Build grand public buildings, and grandeur itself would breed prosperity and civic virtue, raise the monuments, and better citizens would follow. A school was the perfect vessel for that creed, so schools stopped looking like schools. They put on columned facades, borrowed from Greek temples, installed ceremonial staircases meant to be climbed slowly in your best clothes, and carved out auditoriums seating hundreds cathedral rooms for a town that had never filled a room that size in its life. The style had a name, Beaux-Arts, after the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, where its leading architects had trained, and it prized symmetry, columns, and grand ceremonial approaches above all. But a temple needs worshippers, and the timing was uncanny. Just as the towns craved bodies to justify their palaces, the law began manufacturing pupils. For the first time in history, the state reached into every home and compelled every child into a classroom. It started in Massachusetts. In 1852, the Commonwealth passed the first compulsory school attendance law in the nation. Parents who kept a child home now faced a fine, and newly appointed truant officers were empowered to enforce it. The schoolroom door was suddenly backed by the power of the courts. Send your children, or answer to the state. A quiet revolution in the relationship between a family and its government. One by one, the other states followed. The pace quickened after 1900, as reformers pressed state house after state house, and more than 30 states adopted their laws in the 2 decades on either side of the turn of the century. By 1918, all 48 states had compulsory attendance laws on their books. Mississippi, the last to fall into line, that same year, 1918. In 66 years, schooling had gone from a private choice to a public command. Behind the law stood a conviction, and it belonged largely to one man. Horace Mann had reframed the meaning of a schoolhouse. He had served as the first secretary of the Massachusetts Board of Education from 1837, touring hundreds of schoolhouses and pouring what he found into 12 annual reports read far beyond his own state. Mann would die in 1859, having urged a graduating class to be ashamed to die until you have won some victory for humanity. To Mann, the common school was not a convenience or a charity. It was the engine of a democratic republic, where a nation of equals was manufactured, one literate child at a time. So the law demanded children in seats, and the ideal demanded those seats mean something. Together, they guaranteed a flood, but compulsion was only the floor. On top of it came a surge in schooling, unlike anything the world had seen. Economists have a name for it now. Claudia Goldin and Lawrence Katz called this era the high school movement. They laid out the argument in their 2008 book, The Race Between Education and Technology. Goldin would go on to win the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2023 for her broader work on labor and opportunity. Something that had been rare and elite was becoming ordinary and universal almost overnight. The numbers are the story. In 1910, roughly 9% of American 18-year-olds graduated from high school, fewer than 1 in 10. Enrollment in public high schools swelled in step from around 500,000 students in 1900 to more than 6.5 million by 1940. By 1940, that figure had climbed to about 50%. In a single generation, high school went from a privilege to a birthright. And the public was now on the hook to pay for it. In 1874, the case of Stewart versus School District No. 1 of Kalamazoo settled a question that had hung in the air. Yes, a town could tax all its citizens to fund a free public high school, not just an elementary one. The Michigan Supreme Court handed down the decision, and Justice Thomas Cooley, among the most respected jurists of his age, wrote the opinion that courts in other states would soon lean upon. The taxpayer became the patron of secondary education, whether he had children or not. Put those forces together, and the demand for seats was undeniably exploding. Real children were coming. Real classrooms were needed. If the story ended there, the palace schools would simply be a sensible response to a growing nation. But it does not end there. Because the buildings weren't sized to the demand that existed. They were sized to a demand that had been promised. The architects drew not for the town on the map, but for the city on the horizon, the one every booster swore was coming. And it was easy to believe. The whole country seemed to be inflating like a balloon. The United States population leapt from 76 million in 1900 to 106 million by 1920, 30 million more Americans in 20 years. Much of that surge poured through immigrant gateways like Ellis Island, which in a single record year, 1907, admitted roughly 1.28 million newcomers to the country. Growth like that felt less like a trend than a law of nature. Nowhere did it feel more inevitable than on the frontier of settlement. Railroad companies were laying track across empty country, and land speculators followed the rails like gulls following a plow. The railroads themselves fed the frenzy, printing lavish brochures and offering cheap excursion fares to lure settlers onto land the government had granted them by the millions of acres. A depot today, a boomtown tomorrow, a city the year after. Explosive local growth didn't just seem possible, it seemed guaranteed. Every town had its prophets. The boosters, newspaper editors, bankers, real estate men, projected their villages of a few thousand into cities of tens of thousands. They printed the forecasts in pamphlets and sold lots against them. And when it came time to build a school, they built for the population in the pamphlet, not the population in the pews. So the architect drew for the imagined city. The result was a building whose scale mocked the town around it, a schoolhouse whose capacity dwarfed the entire population of children the community actually possessed. The buildings rose 3 to 5 stories into a prairie sky that had never held anything taller than a grain elevator. Inside went marble floors, ornamental staircases turning on grand landings, and columned entrances built to make a child feel small before something great. The auditoriums were the boldest gamble of all. They were designed to seat several hundred people, sometimes well over 1,000. Rooms larger than any church, any hall, any gathering the town had ever assembled. Rooms built for the crowds of a future promised in a pamphlet. And the classrooms told the same story of faith over fact. The planned pupil capacity often exceeded the number of children the whole town actually had, not the number enrolled, the number in existence. You could gather every child for miles and still leave the desks half empty. Palaces are not cheap, and these towns were not rich. So they did the only thing a gambler with a good story can do. They mortgaged themselves. They borrowed against the tax base that existed only on paper, in the future, in the city that had not yet arrived. The instrument was the bond. School bonds and municipal bonds financed the monumental construction, sold to investors who were buying, in effect, a share of the town's optimism. The stone was real. The collateral was a prophecy. And everyone signing the papers understood the logic, because it was seductive. The debt was justified entirely by projected growth. More people, higher property values, a swelling roll of taxpayers. Tomorrow's booming city would easily repay today's borrowing. All the town had to do was grow into its own building. Nowhere was that wager purer or more naked than in the mining boomtowns of the West. In farm country, growth was a slow guess. In mining country, a single strike could birth a would-be metropolis overnight. And no place made the bet more completely than Goldfield, Nevada. The story starts, as these stories do, with gold in the ground. Gold was discovered at Goldfield in 1902, and the discovery ignited a rush. Two prospectors, Harry Stimler and William Marsh, had located the first claims on a low rise they nicknamed Grandpa. Within 5 years, the Goldfield Consolidated Mines Company was pulling roughly $11 million in ore from the ground in the single year of 1907. Men poured across the Nevada desert toward a patch of sand that, a year earlier, had held almost nothing at all. And for a breathless moment, the prophecy came true. At its peak around 1906 to 1908, Goldfield held roughly 20,000 people. This dot in the desert had become, briefly, the largest city in the entire state of Nevada. To advertise the boomtown to the world, the fight promoter Tex Rickard staged a lightweight championship bout there in September 1906. Joe Gans against battling Nelson, 42 brutal rounds under the desert sun. 2 years later, the 4-story Goldfield Hotel opened with mahogany paneling and gold leaf ceilings, as if to prove the city meant to last a century. If ever a town had earned the right to build big, it was this one. So it did. In 1907, Goldfield completed a high school, a substantial building of stone, solid and permanent, the kind you raise when you are certain your children's children will fill it. Built of dressed stone, it was laid out for hundreds of students in a district that within a few short years would struggle to fill a fraction of its rooms. A promise cast in masonry, we are here to stay, we are only beginning. And then the future simply refused to arrive. This is the hinge of the whole American story. The moment the music stops, the ore ran out. The crowds that had come for gold vanished as fast as they had appeared, and the palace schools were left echoing in half-empty rooms. At Goldfield, the reckoning was brutal and swift. The mines that had summoned 20,000 people were largely spent within a decade of the strike. The bitter miners' strike in 1907 had already brought federal troops marching into the streets, and by 1912, the richest veins were tapping out. A flash flood roared through the town in 1913, and a fire in 1923 devoured much of what the water had spared. The gold that built the city could not sustain it. There had never been enough to sustain a city at all, only enough to conjure the illusion of one. And when the gold went, the people went. The population collapsed from 20,000 to a few hundred. Today, Goldfield endures as the seat of Esmeralda County, home to roughly 250 residents. The Stone High School still stands over a town that would fit inside its own auditorium. And Goldfield was not an outlier, it was the pattern, written large and fast. Across the country, overbuilt schools enrolled only a fraction of their designed capacity. Grand halls built for 1,000 serving 100. Corridors laid out for crowds that walked half empty from the first day the doors opened. The buildings, meant to summon prosperity, became millstones around the town's necks. The grandeur that was supposed to lift the community began instead to drag it down. Consider the sheer physical burden of the thing. Heating and maintaining these oversized structures strained dwindling local budgets to the breaking point. You still had to warm every cavernous room, patch every acre of roof, light every marble corridor, for a student body that never came close to filling them. And there was no cavalry over the hill. In many of these towns, enrollment never approached the projected numbers. Not the next year, not the next decade, not ever. The city in the pamphlet had been a mirage, and the building was the only part of it that turned out to be real. There is a cruel irony in the stone. The grandeur meant to summon growth now testified to its absence. Every column, every landing, every empty seat in that 1,000-seat hall was a monument not to the future the town had promised itself, but to the future it never got. For a while, these buildings simply lingered, too grand to love, too costly to keep, too solid to fall down. But by the middle of the century, a second force arrived to finish what stagnation had started. The palaces were emptied for good. That force was consolidation. Across the 20th century, a great wave of school district consolidation swept the country, merging tiny districts and shuttering thousands of small and oversized schools. The numbers are staggering. In 1940, the country still counted roughly 117,000 school districts, but by the 1970s, fewer than 18,000 were left. Tens of thousands of local schools closed or absorbed in a single generation. The logic was efficiency. One good school to replace many struggling ones. For the palace schools, it was a death sentence. And so the monuments met their various ends. Some were demolished, their marble hauled away, their stone sold off. Others found second lives, converted into apartments, into museums, into civic offices. The auditorium become a lobby, the classrooms become bedrooms, the grand staircase now climbed by tenants carrying groceries. A lucky handful earned a kind of dignity in their afterlife. Many of the survivors were later listed on the National Register of Historic Places, protected precisely because of the ambition that had nearly bankrupted the towns that built them. What was once folly became heritage. But strip away the fate of the buildings, and something more interesting remains: the belief encoded in the stone itself. The palace schools were the physical form of one very particular idea about how the world works. That idea was the beating heart of City Beautiful, that a grand environment would shape better, more prosperous citizens, that if you surrounded ordinary people with beauty and order and monumental scale, you would lift the people themselves. Architecture was not a response to a society, it was a way of engineering one. And the school was where three American faiths fused into a single building. The compulsion of the law, which filled the seats. The civic ambition of City Beautiful, which raised the columns. The speculative optimism of the frontier, which signed the bonds. All three poured into one structure of stone and marble and glass. Which means these schools were never really answers to a question. They were designed as declarations of destiny, not responses to demand, built to announce a future rather than to serve a present. The town was not saying we have these children. It was saying we will become this city, and here is the proof, 40 feet tall, on Main Street. And that is what endures. The palace-sized schools remain as monuments to a distinctly American gamble, a wager in which architecture was cast as prophecy, and stone was laid down for a future that the census never delivered. Drive the back roads today and you can still find them. Grand school buildings still stand in towns that never grew into cities. Solemn Beaux-Arts giants presiding over a gas station, a diner, and a few hundred people. They are too big for where they are. They always were. And that mismatch is exactly what makes them worth reading. They embody both the civic idealism and the hubris of population forecasting. The beautiful confidence that a town could see its own future and build straight toward it, and the hard lesson that a forecast is not a fact. Their scale is their message. The sheer size of these buildings preserves the ambition of an age that genuinely believed it could build tomorrow into being, that if you raised the school first, the city would have no choice but to come and fill it. They built schools for cities that never came. And maybe that is not only a story of failure. These towns dared to build for a future they could not see. And if the future betrayed them, the daring is still standing there in stone, honest and enormous. The palace schools are what ambition looks like when the census disagrees. If you'd like more forgotten stories hiding in plain sight across America, consider subscribing and staying a while.